You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to Horror Babble. We're back today with a dark tale by the English author John Metcalfe, author of The Tunnel, which we recorded last year. Time Fuse, published in the 1931 collection Judas and Other Stories, is the tale of a séance conducted by a lady with a more than casual interest in spiritualism. We hope you enjoy this one. Time Fuse by John Metcalfe. 1. Miss Moody, when Eddie Fisk had gone, sat at her table in the sewing room, looking over the papers about spiritualism which she had left. She had large, masculine hands, knuckles slightly swollen by rheumatism, and heavy, painstaking thumbs. Her movements, as she shook the papers together into a neat pile on her left and transferred each as soon as she had glanced through it to an equally neat pile on her right, were methodical with a sort of restrained hopelessness. Now and again, however, her expression quickened. She breathed noisily, and her eyes grew luminous with interest. Mr. Fisk had given her an occult review, some copies of Light, and a sheaf of propagandist broadsides entitled collectively The Other Side. There would not be time for her to do more than skim this literature during the weekend, yet Eddie would unreasonably expect her to know all about it before Monday evening's séance. She frowned vaguely and sighed, laying the last broadside carefully upon the pile. Her face was long, sombre, rather equine in cast, and with a look of despondent fidelity which certainly supported the resemblance to a horse. Mr. Fisk, indeed, had made a more recherché comparison. Returning with his brother Gilbert from the northwest of Canada, he had decided that his former landlady reminded him of a bull moose. Of this Miss Moody had suspected nothing. Before the war, Eddie and Gilbert, with a third brother, Morris, had been her first guests in the house on Gordon Square. Originally a dressmaker, Miss Moody, on her father's death, had been enabled to lease the entire premises of which she had till then inhabited a single floor, and that the highest and most inconvenient. Reserving these old apartments for her own continued use, she had converted the remainder into a boarding establishment, enlisting in this venture the cooperation of her widowed sister, Janet Phillimore, who performed the offices of cook. During some strenuous but modestly remunerative dozen years, the two of them had entertained successfully, as the remarks book in the hall would show, more than 2,000 gratefully admiring gentlemen, and, by exception only it would seem, the difference in the totals being so pronounced, close on 100 of their wives and families. For gentlemen, indeed, Miss Moody's preference was fixed. She was large-hearted, awkward, incapable of finesse or any shade of cattiness. Her boarders, beginning usually by laughing at her raw-boned frame and at that curious dark-muzzled-looking face of hers, would end by feeling for her something like affection, at the least respect. A good sort, a good creature, one of the best. A few of them, like the brothers Fisk, would even call her Ellen, and be admitted to the intimacy of the upper floor, where she had practiced, long ago, her trade of dressmaking. Here, in the sitting-room, there still remained a sewing machine, and by the window-seat a pair of dress forms. These latter were a standing joke between Miss Moody and her visitors. Eddie, particularly, was used to swear at them. Their extreme air of tepid ladylikeness extending upwards till the neck was reached, but ending there in neuter horror of a black-polished knob, would almost always move him to profanity. Janet, whilst generally approving of her sister's friends, could wish that Eddie's language were a little more restrained, and a more serious count that he would cease to worry Ellen with those everlasting trashy books. Unitarianism, Theosophy, the Ethical Church, Vegetarianism, the Yogi breathing system, Taoism, and now Spiritism. Ellen was always getting bitten by the virus of some new and foolish cult and mazing her poor wits with it. She was vulnerable to strange religions as other people are to measles or to chicken-pox, and Eddie, far from checking her or talking sensibly, persisted, on the contrary, in humouring her fantastic whims. He would laugh almost openly at all these fads himself, yet by some curious quirk of character appeared to find amusement in making her their dupe. Ellen, meanwhile, continued, muddled yet dumbly confident of something in these far-fetched creeds, constantly being disappointed in each one, yet always hopefully proceeding to the next. For Gilbert, Janet had far greater tolerance. Gilbert was tall, commanding, with a hearty breeziness, much more of a man, she thought, than Eddie, who behaved clownishly and had a reedy voice. Neither Eddie nor Gilbert were boarders any longer, having embarked on business in a hide and tannery concern which lay too far away at Kennington. Both of them, however, would drop in every now and then as time and opportunities allowed. Eddie especially, since he had taken up with Spiritism and found that he had mediumistic powers, was always coming with fresh tracts and booklets to the house. Of the third brother, Morris, none of them, least of all Miss Moody, cared to speak. Amongst a long and constantly extending series of soft spots, this one, and even after he was dead, remained the softest still. Unconfessedly, it was the obstinately painful memory of Maurice Fiske which, more than anything, provided impetus for those researches into Spiritism which Janet so deplored. Maurice, quieter than the other two, with a reserve and gentleness of manner likely at first to be mistaken for timidity, had come to say good-bye to Ellen before he went off to the war, and given her his photo. His eyes had held a dumb, startled look of suffering. As he was finally descending the front stairs and passing through the lounge into the hall, he had shaken hands with her 3 times, but whether out of absent-mindedness or no, she could not quite be sure. Now, as Miss Moody finished the perusal of her literature and slowly crossed the room to poke the fire, she wondered how it was that Morris had got killed. Nobody knew exactly, or at any rate Eddie, when she questioned him, had appeared loath to say. Eddie was disappointing in some ways. After the last séance held some few days ago, and in this very room, Ellen had asked him, had he got any message? And Eddie had looked curious, confused, almost displeased. Surely that was unreasonable. Surely with that miracle of disappearing flowers fresh in every mind, it wasn't so preposterous that she should imagine he had heard from Morris. It was 6 o'clock. The March evening was cold. It was getting dark. She would have to go downstairs and look in on Janet in the kitchen. But before descending, she returned to the table and glanced once more at one of the leaflets. It was an account of the life and mediumship of Daniel Home. Mr. Home, as everybody knew, had been a genuine and wonderfully gifted medium, and carried glowing coals upon his head and held them in his hands. Her eyes lit, and her breathing became rapid. Somehow, though Ellen could not have explained this to herself, she felt that if she too could emulate this feat, if she herself could do a thing like that, then something in her brain that troubled her would be resolved and pacified, disproved or proved. She would feel better about Maurice Fiske. 2. "Well," said Janet, "even if those flowers did vanish, and I'm not actually saying they didn't, what does it prove? It proves they vanished, that's all. And what good does that do? Does it help us to run this boarding house any better, I should like to know?" "Oh, but it proves a lot of things, if you think far enough. It proves—" Ellen hesitated, suddenly losing what it had been in her mind to say. Whenever Janet pounced on her like this, she became flustered and unable to go on. She ended lamely. It proves that there are other laws we don't know anything about. Eddie was saying that it proved a fourth dimension. Janet was shorter than her sister, crisper and sharper-tongued, with black hair, thick eyebrows, and a complexion harshly reddened by 12 years of cooking. She removed the stove lid with a clatter, set a large saucepan in its place, then turned and said contemptuously, "A fourth dimension, eh? When I can see and smell it, I'll believe in it. What does it do? If it had helped to keep the oven hot or stop my face from getting scorched." Miss Moody, unequal to the contest, retreated sadly from the kitchen. Not only was she incapable of reasoning with Janet in these moods, but it was certainly not fitting that such arguments should be conducted before little Agatha, the scullery maid. Besides, there had been something in her sister's last remarks which curiously discomposed her. It had been funny that she had said that about the fire scorching her. Supper was over, and Ellen paused for a few moments in the lounge to talk with Mr. Brace. The Braces, man and wife, had now been permanents for 7 months. Mr. Brace was a very old, bald-headed gentleman retired from the retail hosiery profession, but his wife was much younger, with blondined hair, hardly middle-aged, and occasionally quite pretty. Both had been present at the séance. "Coming upstairs on Monday? Yes, of course we'll come. Though, mind you, we don't swallow all we're told. Too highty-flighty in his ways, your friend, for me. Too jokey. And those disappearing flowers. I'm too hard-headed, I suppose. Still, we'll be glad to come." Miss Moody passed upstairs to her own floor. The Braces, though still sceptical, were genial and not contemptuous like Janet. Talk with them had somewhat re-established her. She took up some sewing from a chair and brought it underneath the light. Janet would come up presently to retire for the night, and Agatha, who now slept in on a camp bed in the adjoining room, but for a while she had the evening to herself. As she sewed, she thought over old Mr. Brace's words concerning Eddie. His comments, she regretfully admitted, had upon the whole been just. Eddie, as an advocate, was not convincing. That was his way. His manner was too often flippant and facetious. Yet, if the thing were true, it remained true however Eddie acted, even if he did not entirely believe in it himself. One could have powers of which one was not worthy. But if you were sincere, if you were worthy, surely that would mean greater power still. Miss Moody rose to fetch a thimble, and caught her reflection in the glass. A darting remembrance of something which Mr. Brace had said about her hair distracted her, and made her smile. It made some impudent, though evidently complimentary remark, for which his wife pretended to rebuke him. Godiva! What was that? Old sauce-pot, and at his age, too. Ellen's hair, copious, brown and lustrous, her single beauty. She patted it, and her smile grew broader, emphasizing large teeth and rather exposed gums. Ooh, he has a cheek, but he's a nice old thing. A short, gruff laugh escaped her, and she performed an awkward pirouetting motion. Occasionally, when unexpected flattery made her bashful, she had a way of flushing suddenly and mildly teetering, tricks which, although ingratiating and coquettish in her early girlhood, were now an inappropriate survival. Presently, she resumed her sewing. Up here it was usually very quiet, but tonight there was a wind, sprung up since supper-time, rattling the panes and making curious yawning noises round the eaves. It blew all at once down the chimney, puffing a cloud of smoke into the room. An ember fell into the grate. Ellen, sneezing violently, stared at it fixedly some moments. Its bright redness dulled, changed as she watched to a dead grey, yet it would still be much too hot to touch. Her thoughts turned once again to Mr. Home. What had that booklet said? Though she had only scanned it cursorily, she found that she was able to remember certain phrases word for word. Home, in the presence of witnesses whose probity and public records placed them beyond suspicion of collusion in any form of trickery, on several occasions thrust his hand amidst the red-hot coals, and, withdrawing some of them from the fire, set them upon his head. This amazing performance was attended by no pain or other ill effects, and neither his hands nor scalp showed the slightest trace of any burn. Miss Moody sighed sharply. Accounts of such an exploit captivated and at the same time terrified her. The mirror before which she had stood a few minutes ago to admire her hair was opposite her still, and for a second she could see a look almost of suffering on her face. To banish it, she forced herself to smile, then dropped her glance and shifted her position slightly from the fire. Faith. It was faith, she knew, that had enabled him to perform miracles like that. With enough faith, one could do anything, even she, Ellen. Her lips parted, and she caught her breath. She felt tortured. Oh, God, give me faith. That was all right, to pray to God for faith. The spiritualists believed in him. But fire, she was more terrified of fire than anything. And Janet's disbelief made it more difficult. It had been Janet all along who had prevented her from being what she might. Suddenly, she started, checking a cry. She had, whilst thinking about Mr. Home, mechanically continued sewing, and now her glance, becoming less abstracted, fixed itself in surprise upon her needle. She stared at it frozenly. The threaded eye was visible outside the thumb of her left hand that held her work. The other end, the point, projected perhaps half an inch upon the inner side, towards the fingers. Then she had pricked herself, driven the needle seemingly right through her thumb. Yet she felt nothing. She could not believe it. For some seconds she stared, and then, hesitantly, began to draw the needle out and backwards. Yes, true enough. It must almost have grazed the bone. It was out now, and blood was flowing, though not copiously. How was it that it didn't hurt? She rose from her chair, conscious all at once of a peculiar numbness. But the numbness was not mere absence of sensation. It was something, a positive something, charging, filling her. She could feel it rapidly invading her, extending itself outwards from the center of her body towards her head and hands and feet, in stages, like the beating of a pulse or like a clock, as if, inside of her, numbers were being counted, very quickly, numbers that mounted up a scale to a predestined figure. And there was silence. The noise of the wind in the road had ceased, was lost to her. Within her brain as well was silence, more profound. When the counting was over and the final number reached, the silence would be absolute. Then, Ellen knew, she could do anything. Now, she bent, put out a hand towards the fire. She saw her fingers in the flames, moving among the coals. She pulled out 2 or 3 of these, red-hot, transferred them to her other hand. Her sleeves were short, and for a while she drew the embers up and down her lower arms. Finally, she pressed them to her cheeks, placed them upon her head. The door was being slowly pushed ajar. Someone was peering in. Agatha. Miss Moody, though she had not heard the sounds of her approach, nor yet her knock, could clearly see at first the look of wild incomprehension on her face. "Come in, Agatha, and shut the door." Ellen was not sure whether her voice, level and calm and reassuring as she hoped, were audible or no. Agatha's eyes had now grown wide in horror. She was opening her mouth to scream. 3. Ellen, wrapped in her dressing gown, was sitting up in bed. It was Sunday morning, and nearly 11 o'clock, but she had no intention of rising till the afternoon. Janet, after her first bewildered, "What, not getting up? Do you feel ill?" had gone her way downstairs without another word, probably quite convinced that to account for this unprecedented state of things, her sister must have something seriously wrong with her. She had ascended later with the breakfast tray. "Well, anyhow, your appetite's quite good. It seems I needn't fetch the doctor after all." She was evidently prepared to be indignant and sarcastic, but on meeting Miss Moody's glance thought better of it. Her own eyes, usually so sharp and menacing under their thick brows, had lowered suddenly as if she were afraid. No, certainly Miss Moody didn't need the doctor. All that she wanted now was rest, and leisure to think over what had happened on the previous evening, that miracle of which the only witness had as yet been Agatha, but whose reality would presently be wonderingly admitted by the world. Meanwhile, she sat and listened to the church bells ringing down the road, their peals confused and muted, at moments altogether silenced by the still unabated clamour of the wind. I, Ellen Moody, am possessed of superhuman powers. She had tried to explain as much to Agatha, when the latter had recovered from her faint, though rather unsuccessfully, she feared. After replacing the embers on the fire, she had lifted the little scullery maid from the floor, where she had fallen by the door, laid her upon the sofa, and hastened to fetch brandy from the cupboard. But Agatha, when with difficulty revived, had only stared at her in horror for an instant, and then mutely turned away, upon the verge, as was too obvious, of a fresh collapse. She had been sick 3 times since then, so Ellen learned, but had, it seemed, said nothing of what she had seen to Janet, or to anybody else. That was as well. Janet, though curious as to the cause of Agatha's indisposition, would certainly not credit it, if she were told. She had come up grumblingly a little later, as Ellen had been getting into bed, and rated her for pampering people in hysterics. And now, this morning, left short-handed in the kitchen and with nobody but herself to superintend the running of the whole establishment, her temper would undoubtedly be worse than ever. But before long Janet would know. She too, like Agatha, would understand. Not yet, not till tomorrow evening at the séance. Miss Moody raised herself against her pillows, took a long, deep breath. She would attempt nothing till then. That, something told her, would be wise, respectful of the power given her. She must have time to think, to know this different self that now she was, to fit herself again. And, while she waited, she was anxious to be undisturbed, not have to talk to anyone, not even Agatha. Indeed, for some obscure reason that evaded her, she wanted Agatha the least of all. Later in the day, after dinner, she got up and came downstairs. There were concerned inquiries from the Braces, from all her other boarders. Had she been ill, and was she better now? Janet, upon the point she saw of bursting into protest, looked at her curiously and changed her mind. Ellen knew why. She knew now that she was different. Already they as well could apprehend this difference, all of them. She felt a confident languor expanding, filling her. She was shining at them, at everybody who came near to her. Tea over, she once more retired to her bedroom, and spent the remainder of the evening in looking over Eddie's papers. Poor Eddie! He was in some ways to be pitied, yet he too had powers. She must not forget that. She must be grateful to him, even in his ignorance and flippancy, for showing her, for pointing out the path. It was only after she had seen him make those flowers disappear that she had had the faith, and for the sake of Morris. She looked at herself intently in the mirror. I, Ellen Moody. 4. Agatha had packed her trunk and left. Miss Moody could still see her small, scared face as she had passed her on the stairs. Janet had been outraged. What was wrong with the girl? She must be made to stop another week at least, to give notice properly. But Ellen, though she was sorry to see Agatha depart, said no. Let her go. It was no use to keep her if she didn't want to stay. That had been early in the morning, and now it was afternoon. Monday afternoon, and not so very long before the séance. Miss Moody went about her work as usual, saw that the tea, for such as wanted it, was set out on the little copper-covered tables in the lounge, added accounts, made out a bill or two, and interviewed the plumbers who had come to fix the washbowl taps in number 8. At supper, she presided with her customary cheerfulness, rallying Mr. Brace upon the vaunted hardness of his head. Well, we'll see. I'm not that bigoted. If the thing's not a fraud, I'm quite agreeable to be convinced. Look here, if I could only get a line on Sammy Price, who got his ticket in a motor smash last year. He owed me £40. Old Mr. Brace was really terrible, and Ellen should not have encouraged him. His wife didn't like it, nor, it was plain, did Janet, who, though responsible for preparation of the meals, was usually able to sit down to them beside her sister. Her frowns, however, were without effect upon Miss Moody. Ellen had hitherto refrained from talk of spiritualism or other cults in public, but for tonight felt careless of offence. What if it were bad taste or impolitic? What if some of them didn't like it? Perhaps a few who hadn't heard of it might become interested, wish to join the séance. Shortly after 8:30, a thunderous tattoo on the front door, executed in the rhythm of the policeman's holiday, indicated the arrival of Eddie. He entered, carrying a large box-shaped object, something like a botanical press, bound with 2 leather straps. When he had exchanged greetings with Miss Moody, he humorously extended a little finger towards Mr. Brace, who had walked out with her into the hall. Mr. Brace, having gravely shaken the finger, tapped on the box. "Family keeping well, I trust, sir?" he inquired waggishly. "Not giving any trouble?" Eddie smiled and shook his head. "No, thank you, Grandad. Family's okay. Sophronia Gamma's got a little flighty since she's been acting as control to Gertie Gush, the movie star, that's all. Otherwise in the pink." Mr. Fisk was short, fair and dapper, with a tiny blonde moustache. He had sharp, restless eyes of a shallow grey, and was a little overdressed, wearing a blue silk waistcoat with enamelled buttons, and cloth-topped patent leather shoes. His feet were very small. "All of us ready?" he asked Ellen, casting a glance beyond her towards the lounge. "Gilbert's so sorry that he couldn't come. He's got a cold." "Yes, we're all ready." Miss Moody had turned and made a signalling motion with one hand. Mrs. Brace and 4 or 5 others had detached themselves with an attempted air of casualness from the remainder of the company, and now were wending their way rather sheepishly into the hall. 2 of them, gentlemen who had not assisted at the previous séances, Mr. Brace introduced very carefully to Mr. Fisk, as if he thought that Eddie might explode. Somebody uttered an embarrassed laugh. "Well, shall we go upstairs?" Miss Moody headed the procession, with Janet more than usually sour bringing up the rear. Mr. Brace, the irrepressible, offered to carry Eddie's box. "Oh, no, you don't. My ladies don't like strangers." Ellen, hearing this badinage behind her, turned and spoke rebukefully. "Now, please, we must be serious." Eddie, as soon as they were all collected in the room, briskly began to tell them off upon his fingers. 8 of us, 4 ladies and 4 gentlemen. That's very nice. We'll sit the same as we arranged last week, alternately. Miss Moody here by me, Miss Winter there, then Mr. Tharp and Mrs. Phillimore. We want another chair or 2, I think." He distributed the company in a circle round the table. "Now, well, we might as well begin. Perhaps Mrs. Phillimore would be so good as to turn off the light." With the extinction of the light, Ellen was conscious of a thrill. It was dark, but not entirely so, for a dull glow shone redly from the fire. Young Mr. Simpson, one of the two newcomers, spoke diffidently. "Hadn't we better put a screen in front?" How rapidly the general atmosphere of eeriness had told on him was evident in his voice. His tones were almost reverent. "Oh, no, it's not enough to matter, but we ought really to have music, a piano or something. I get started easier. It's a pity." Mr. Brace gave a sudden cough, and then, as if afraid that it had sounded sceptical, repeated it more sympathetically. Miss Moody was just able to see Eddie's face. Though not, as he was careful to explain, a trance medium in the strictest sense, it was his custom to go off a little at the commencement of a séance. He had now closed his eyes, was fidgeting upon his chair. "You know, it takes a little while to come. Some nights I'm good and some I'm bad. It all depends upon conditions. I mean, it's more than simply turning on a tap." Ellen had heard all these preliminary remarks before. Presently he would begin to sway slightly, and his thin voice would take on a sing-song quality. Yes, it was getting like that now. "Ah!" He sat up, and drew in his breath sharply. "Mrs. Brace, do you mind giving me your hand? Thank you. The name George is given me. Elderly man, well past the middle age. Medium height, eyes very dark. Passed over several years ago. I get a fullness here, a sort of tightness. Painful." Eddie had placed his other hand upon his chest. "Was it pneumonia or bronchitis?" "No, lung trouble, consumption. He passed over 7 years ago, in 1920. "Then you recognized the name and the description?" "Well, yes, I think so. Only his name was Geoffrey, and he wasn't very old." "An elder brother, perhaps?" "Well, no," said Mrs. Brace, confused. "He was younger, a younger brother." After a short pause, she inquired timidly, Is there any message?" "Yes," replied Eddie. "He says, wait, I must catch it clearly. He says, what you're passing through just now is only for a time, not long. You are to have strength and courage." "Oh, thank you." Mrs. Brace withdrew her hand, retired gratefully into obscurity. It went on. Next, Mr. Simpson. After him, Miss Winter. Mr. Brace. Eddie had messages tonight, it seemed, for everyone but Ellen and her sister. That there were none for her, Miss Moody was not sorry. Usually she would be breathlessly absorbed in all that Mr. Fisk would say and do, but now she was nervous, impatient, wished he would get on. She was looking forward to, and yet half dreading what was to happen after he had done. None of them knew, not Janet and not Eddie, what she had got in store. Morris, perhaps? Her throat grew dry. Perhaps. Mr. Fisk was talking, this time in his natural voice. The light had been turned on, and he was smiling guardedly, wiping his face at intervals with a blue handkerchief. The sitting had exhausted him. Janet, endeavoring to look at him sarcastically, blinked suddenly and gave a formidable sneeze. "And now," said Eddie, "we're just going to try the slate trick." Ellen wished that he would not be so profane, and that his manner and appearance were less chirpy, sparrow-like. Of course, his calling things a trick was just his way. But Mr. Brace, for instance, he would be certain not to understand. He would be sure to think. Mr. Brace, however, had to confess himself completely mystified. From his box, Eddie produced what seemed to be an ordinary school slate and fragment of slate pencil. He and Mr. Brace, now sitting opposite each other, held up the slate securely pressed against the table's underside, the pencil having first been introduced between the two. Mr. Simpson had previously been persuaded to write a question on a slip of paper which he had folded up and put into his pocket. After a few moments, a faint scratching sound was heard, which continued for perhaps half a minute. When it ceased, the slate was removed, and the writing on it compared with that upon the paper. Mr. Simpson's question had been, trivially, "How many buttons are there on my suit?" To which the answer ran, "Add the numbers of the year of your birth." As Mr. Simpson had been born in 1899, this gave the total 27, a figure which, if trousers were included, he admitted to be accurate. "There, then," said Eddie, beaming. "You got more than you asked for, didn't you? You see, it's extra proof to answer you that way. None of us knew the year when you were born." Muttered Mr. Brace. "It's clever, very clever. I'll admit you've got me shaky. And it's been most interesting. I'm sure we're all exceedingly obliged." "Oh, but," said Ellen, "we aren't going yet. It's hardly 9:30. I was so hoping that you'd do the flower experiment again." She flushed, annoyed that she herself had barely escaped saying trick. But that was Eddie's fault. "I'm sure we've lots of time," she went on hastily to cover her confusion. "And I was so looking forward." In her own voice she caught a strange anxiety, excitement. Eddie, too, for some reason, appeared all at once put out of countenance and ruffled, unwilling to comply with her request. "Afraid it'll make me a bit late. You know I'm right across the river now." 5. Ellen faced him, feeling her cheeks grow hot. Oh, but it wouldn't take so long as that. Hardly a minute. She wondered, why did she insist so vehemently? Was it because that miracle of disappearing flowers had first persuaded and convinced her, given her the faith to do what she herself had done 2 days ago? Eddie was still demurring. "Rather rushed tonight. There's Gilbert ill, and then I haven't got the apparatus handy," said Mr. Brace, although benevolently. "His apparatus, really, that sounds bad." "Nonsense," said Eddie, reddening. "We wanted apparatus for the thing we did just now, if you call slates and pencils apparatus. Next time we'll do the flower stunt and everything. And the direct voice, too, if you don't call a trumpet too much of an apparatus." Said Mr. Brace again, now slightly less benevolent and evidently inclined to grow contentious. "All right, young man. No doubt you know what program suits you best. But all the same, if I remember right, all that you needed when you worked that little piece of mystery before was just an ordinary cut-glass vase and 3 geraniums. At least that's all that anybody saw." "All right." Eddie was now exasperated, smiling but finding it a little difficult to keep his temper. "Of course, if you intend to challenge me. Of course, to you, I suppose, there's nothing in conditions. A vase is just a vase, and flowers, flowers. I'll try it, but if it doesn't happen to come off, then don't blame me." He had resumed his seat, lips pursed. Janet had brought a vase containing 6 carnations from the adjoining room. "Lights out, I suppose?" said Mr. Brace sardonically. "Yes, please, at first." Darkness, and once again for Ellen, that peculiar thrill. She was still next to Eddie, could see his lowered profile dimly at intervals, infer the motions of his hands. He was, she thought, somehow a little nervous, and this troubled her, made her more anxious that he should succeed. Then Mr. Brace would see, and she too would then have strength to do as she had planned, repeat her miracle before them all, play with the red-hot coals. Her breath caught chokingly. The seconds passed. What was delaying Eddie? On the last occasion, she remembered, as soon as the lights were turned on, the flowers had been discovered, no longer in the vase, but shut up in her work-box in a far corner of the room. Then, in the sight of all, they had, as they were watching, disappeared. They were there, and then they were just not there. It was a double wonder. But tonight the first part seemed to take much longer. That was Mr. Brace's fault for talking as he had and making the conditions adverse. Presently, however, he would be confounded as before, and— her thought halted abruptly, went on again next instant with distressed intentness. Uneasiness, now mounting to acute alarm, had for some seconds anticipated recognition of its cause. Then, when she understood, her heart turned over sickly. She felt faint. It was Eddie. Something was wrong. She heard the noise of shivered glass, an object falling to the floor, a muttered curse. Oh, what was Eddie doing? What— The light! Suddenly, and like a blow, blinding, making them wince, exclaim. Janet, who had crept to the switch and turned it on, standing indignant, pointing at the broken vase. Her voice trembling with scorn. "Faker! There, that'll show you all! The faker, look at him!" And Eddie discovered, groping, searching apparently beneath the table for whatever he had dropped, emerging presently, his face white and dejected, as if he were about to cry, blinking and stammering. "There, then, just look at him. Look at that thread wound round his hand. I'm sorry to have had to do a thing like this." But it was not upon the abject spectacle of Eddie, however dismally engrossing, that their attention remained fixed for long. Something far worse and far more discomposing than the belated and well-merited exposure of a blundering charlatan was going forward in this room. It was at Ellen that they looked. Miss Moody had risen from her chair, her mouth open, though for a time no sound emerged. Terror, or pain, or both seemed to have checked her speech. She held up her arms, swayed, tottering. At last her voice was heard, ending upon a shriek. "Fire! To the fire!" To Janet, only did her words appear to carry any meaning. "Quick! She must have burnt herself somehow!" She sprang across the room towards her sister, dragging the cloth from off the table on her way, and sending Eddie's paraphernalia crashing to the floor. "Run quick! The tablecloth's no good, too thin. Blankets, in the next room. She's burnt herself." Burnt. Ellen, before her anguish had become too great, could realize that. Ellen alone, it might be Agatha as well if she were here, could for some tortured seconds understand. The fire, that fire she had scorned 2 days ago, now had its way with her, unchecked. Upon her face, her head, her arms and hands, wherever she had held the coals, the scars appeared. Her flesh was blackening. She could apprehend no more. Her mind faded, dissolved in an inordinate agony. She began to run wildly, in small circles, hither and thither, trying to cool herself, uttering shriek upon shriek. "Blankets! Fetch blankets!" Finally, perceiving that the rest were still too stunned and horror-struck to be of any help, Janet was forced to run for them herself into the bedroom, tear them from off the bed. But though she made what speed of it she could, returning with a couple almost instantly, her efforts were in vain. She was, she found, too late. The screams that filled the room a moment since had ceased. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time.